following sermon was delivered at the 10:30 worship service at the United Methodist Church of Kent. Please enjoy.
It's surprising to me that folks kept inviting Jesus to dinner. Especially in the Gospel of Luke, so many of his most remembered and repeated teachings happen at dinner. Post-resurrection, there's this meal in Emmaus where two fearful folks recognize the risen Christ through the breaking and the sharing of bread. A few days before that, of course, a meal in an upper room where Jesus reinterprets by inhabiting a Passover meal, a meal that we continue to rehearse to this day. And before that, these other meals, a meal shared out in a field, or a meal shared in the home of a tax collector, or today's meal, a meal shared in the home of a local leader. Over and over again throughout the gospel, folks kept inviting Jesus to dinner, or admittedly, sometimes Jesus invited himself to dinner. But either way, he never was great at what we might call today polite dinner conversation. There's no small talk with Jesus, at least none that's recorded for us. Instead, what we find is Jesus calling folks to account, calling attention to the many silly games that we play, the many ways that we exclude and divide and ignore, the ways we so often fail to perceive God's presence, both in each other and in creation. And Jesus calls folks back while breaking bread together, calls us out of our current patterns and back toward living as God's beloved. As today's story of a meal begins, we find everyone is watching. The Pharisees, we're told, are watching Jesus. Jesus is watching them, and everyone else is watching each other, all of them seeking the best seats at the table. Everybody is watching. And yet, according to Jesus, none of them really is seeing. None of them is noticing or perceiving the truth about each other. They're so distracted by their efforts at outdoing each other that they cannot focus or give attention where it really matters. But Jesus notices. Jesus notices how all the guests are choosing their seats at the table, sorting themselves out at this dinner party into this neat little hierarchy, each of them, of course, thinking that they belong at the top. And noticing this, Jesus tells this story, this parable. And as always, the story has an edge to it. This time, the edge is offering unsolicited advice about table manners in God's beloved community. When someone invites you to a wedding celebration, Jesus says, don't take your seat in the place of honor. For someone more highly regarded than you could have been invited by your host. The host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give your seat to this other person. Then embarrassed, you'll take your seat in the least important place. So no, instead, Jesus says, when you receive an invitation, go and sit in the least important place. Then when your host approaches, he'll be able to say to you, friend, move up here to a better seat, and you'll be honored in the presence of your fellow guests. And if we stop reading the story there with this first parable, this can sound to us like practical, maybe even strategic advice. Like if we scramble to the front of the room, we might find ourselves asked to move to the back, to the table by the doorway, by the kitchen, by the restroom. So if instead we take the least desirable place right away, then we might find ourselves promoted and will be the envy of all our peers. But as we continue reading the story from the gospel, Jesus' attention shifts. After first addressing the guests who are seeking superiority over one another, he turns and addresses the party's host. And again, here it's really hard to imagine why folks kept inviting him to their dinners. To the person who had invited him, Jesus levels this withering critique. When you host a lunch or a dinner, do not invite your friends, your siblings, your relatives, your rich neighbors. If you do, they'll invite you in return. That will be your reward, this transactional relationship. No, instead, Jesus goes on, when you give a banquet, invite the poor and the sick. And then you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. Instead, you'll be repaid when the just are resurrected. Jesus begins in this dinner party with humility. Sit in the least important place. And then he ties this humility to hospitality. Invite those who cannot repay you. These two practices, humility and hospitality, are crucial to living more fully. And by connecting them, Jesus clarifies what he means, especially by humility, and perhaps what he doesn't mean. Humility is not beating up on ourselves. Humility is not being silenced or getting out of other folks' ways because they are more valuable than we are. Humility really is about getting out of our own way, not spending all of our time and our energy seeking to get ahead, and instead rejoicing in the opportunity to come alongside. Being with and accompanying is hospitality, a habit celebrated throughout the course of our scriptures. Perhaps one of the most familiar references to it is in Hebrews 13, where we're encouraged to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some have entertained angels unawares. That's an echo of an earlier story from Genesis, part of the story of Sarah and Abraham. But here in Hebrews, it's extended to a radical practice of empathy that leads to solidarity. In the next verse, we're told to remember prisoners as if you were in prison with them, and people who are mistreated as if you were in their place. That's the connection between humility and hospitality. Hospitality, which is really welcoming God's presence in each other, is possible only through empathy, identifying with each other. And empathy is possible only if we begin in humility, in this posture of perceiving the truth that we all have equal value, for our value is not born in our achievements or our accomplishments, in what we have done or how we have gotten ahead, but only always in our creation in the image of God. If we're always concerned with elbowing our way past our neighbor, we're not going to perceive them as they are, their goodness, their belovedness in God's image. And if we fail to perceive each other as we are, if instead we perceive each other only as opponents or obstacles or enemies or threats or competitors, then we will all lose out on the fuller life God longs to give us. All who lift themselves up will be brought low, and those who make themselves low will be lifted up. This is not Jesus' strategy for how to play the game. It is freedom. Freedom to know that life is not a game at all. Life is not a competition, but a gift in which we've been given to each other. The prophet Jeremiah, in today's first reading, after first maybe admittedly scolding us, illustrates how depleting it is when we forget this, when we treat life as though it's something that we earn. The community around Jeremiah has forgotten God's provision, forgotten God's liberation, forgotten that God is the one who delivered them out of empire and led them through the wilderness and reconnected them with the land. Forgetting all of that, they think that they've done it themselves. And they believe anxiously then that it's all up to them to hold on to it. And in so believing, and so anxiously behaving, they find themselves empty and depleted. They have forsaken me, God says through the prophet, the spring of living water. And they have dug wells. That is, they have tried to provide for themselves, but they are broken wells that can't hold water. I wonder, have you ever felt like a broken well? Have you ever felt like you fill up for a little while, but it doesn't last? It doesn't hold? And before you know it, you're feeling empty again? When we receive life as a gift, we connect to life's source, a spring of living water that never runs dry. But when instead we behave as though life is our accomplishment, that what we have is what we have won by beating out the competition, when our primary goal is not to do a thing well, but to do it just better than the person next to us, then we build lives that are broken wells. They might look good on the outside, but they can't hold water for long. All who lift themselves up will be brought low. So long as we keep seeking satisfaction by seeking superiority, we will keep finding ourselves exhausted and empty. All who make themselves low will be lifted up, liberated from the endless game of competing, free to live with instead of trying to be over or against each other. In one of his collections of essays, Whistling in the Dark, published back in 1988, Frederick Buechner, the wonderful author and preacher, wrote about the role of competitive games across our culture. This high value that we place on competition in our life together, in our economies, our educational systems, our politics, nearly every aspect of our lives. Games are supposed to build character, he wrote. Healthy competition is supposed to be good for you. But then he wondered, is competition ever really healthy? The desire to do better, to be better, to look better than someone else? Do you ever really write better poetry or play better tennis or stand in higher esteem, even self-esteem, if your chief motivation is just to be head of the pack? Even if you win the rat race, as somebody has said, are you any less a rat? Who wants to win if somebody else has to lose? Who dares to lose if it's crucial to win? But it's not winning that counts, it's how you play the game, they say. Well, maybe, Buechner wondered, maybe neither of them counts. Maybe it's not, in fact, competition, but cooperation that builds the only character worth building. For if it's by playing games together that we learn to win battles, maybe it's by playing, say, music together that we learn to avoid them. Certainly that was Jesus' choice in his words and in his actions. Cooperation, companionship, not competition. Not only is it surprising to me that folks kept inviting Jesus to dinner, perhaps just as surprising is that he kept going, kept engaging with these folks who were so vehemently, violently even, opposed to his ministry, to everything that he said and did and lived for. Well, before today's dinner, already Jesus' relationship with the Pharisees had been rather prickly, we might say. He's spoken with them multiple times, and every time they're looking for opportunities to trip him up, to catch him, even to hurt him. But Jesus doesn't avoid them. Jesus doesn't separate himself from those who disagree. He doesn't shut down the conversation. Instead, he models humility and hospitality by staying with them. For his goal is not to defeat them. His goal is not to win some competition. His goal is to invite them into fuller life. What a challenging and much needed model for us today. When competition is so thoroughly and so clearly preferred, even assumed, to compassion and collaboration. Jesus' model is to turn toward, not away, to show up, to stay with, to value the belovedness even of those who won't value us. Because this new world God's love is creating, this new world is not a competition. There are no higher or lower seats at God's table. There is no VIP section for those who pay the highest price, no reserved seats for those who get there first. In fact, in God's beloved community, there is no regard at all for any of those ladders that we've constructed, that we strive so hard to climb, whether social or economic or educational or citizenship or any other. God's new world is companionship. God's new world is community. God's new world is communion. The table is simply and always open, and there is a place at that table for everyone. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the United Methodist Church of Kent Sermon Podcast. For more information about the church, visit www.kentmethodist.org.